You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 387 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to update what's happening with the Korean peace process. Things have stalled out there with the current U.S. war games, but I did see a little bit of light to indicate we may have some progress soon. Another U.S. soldier died in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia suffered another blow in their attempt to remake Yemen the way they want it. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute. Of course, that's the institute run by the great Scott Horton, managing editor now Pete Raymond. You find my show and my daily news roundup in the right-hand column of the homepage. Once you've listened to a few shows and you like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. It's up everywhere people listen to podcasts, and that way you don't miss an episode, because 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm on here for 20 to 30 minutes updating current events. The way you get the most out of the show is by listening to every one. And last, if you want to be a financial supporter of the show, and I really do appreciate it for all of you who take the time to throw me a couple bucks every month. It really helps to cover costs and lets me know that people are, caring enough about the show and appreciating the information I bring them enough for me to keep doing it. So patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, donate $5 a month, gets you into the monthly live stream. All right, into the news for today. First up, the U.S. has seized a cargo ship heading to Venezuela. It was carrying a food product that I've heard be described as soy cakes. Not really sure what that is. Whatever exactly a soy cake is, it seems like important calories for the Venezuelan people who struggle to, get the calories they need to survive. We talked about a previous study on the show, and this was covered by Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. I'll go ahead and link to this article in the show notes page. But that study found that 40,000 people were at least in part killed by the U.S. sanctions on the Venezuela because of deprivation. This is before even the latest round of U.S. sanctions. So we see that seizing, a food ship headed to Venezuela is going to contribute to the starving and death of the people. Now, yes, I am a libertarian, and I do understand that the Maduro government is in part responsible for the people starving to death. However, this is a literal example of the U.S. government snatching the food out of the mouths of the Venezuelan people. There's a couple things I want to point out with this example, just because I think it becomes so clear and obvious when the U.S. is literally stealing food ships heading to Venezuela, that the Trump policy here on Venezuela is absolutely an aggressive policy. And while it is different in kind than landing Marines in Venezuela, firing rockets, dropping bombs, anything like that, this is still an aggressive foreign policy, an economic war. It is a war by the United States on the people of Venezuela. There's no argument about it. That is what it is. And so that kind of brings me to Congress, where Congress certainly hasn't gone far enough to authorize a war against Venezuela, which is, again, what is being waged against them right now by this Trump policy. And it's very interesting that you have so little will within Congress or even the Democratic Party. You think these candidates on the DNC stage will be crawling over each other to condemn Trump's Venezuela policy when the topic rarely comes up. And here you have the U.S. stealing a food ship. In neighboring Colombia, the drug trade, I'm guessing mostly cocaine, is still a huge problem. And there's some drug routes that are being fought over right now, endangering 300,000 civilians. In the past on the show, I've talked about how all of the refugees and migrants coming from Venezuela, because the situation there is so bad, fleeing to Colombia, are willing to take up about any job they could find. And this has included working, being paid for to be a militant, some of these paramilitary forces there. And so I'm sure, the more instability there is in neighboring Venezuela, the worse the drug trade will be next door in Colombia. Although all that could really be improved by the U.S. just legalizing cocaine and taking the market away from all these really nasty drug traffickers. Trump is putting pressure on Germany to increase its defense spending to 2% of GDP This is the NATO target that's been pushed throughout the Trump administration. This time, Trump threatens that the U.S. will start to move U.S. troops out of Germany and into Poland if Germany doesn't hit these marks. The really unfortunate thing here is, that Trump just wouldn't bring those troops home. Moving them closer to Russia in Poland would be much worse than having them in Germany. And as, I've explained on the show in the past that these soldiers that we deploy to East Europe and apparently moving them more and more eastward really aren't enough to, if Russia did want to invade any of these Baltic states or Poland or something like that, they wouldn't really be able to repel them, but they would act as a tripwire. That means that a whole bunch of Americans die to make sure the U.S. gets involved in a deeper war with Russia. John Bolton traveled to the UK. In the past, the U.S. had been working with the Theresa May government. Now it's Boris Johnson as the head of the UK state. And I believe he's a bit more of a hawk than May was. Previously, I guess Europe, and like UK least so, but especially Europe has been far more committed to the Iran nuclear deal than the US is, and didn't want to take kind of a hardline approach against Iran. Of course, some of this changed when the UK ends up seizing the Iranian ship off of Gibraltar, and we know that John Bolton had a role in trying to get the UK to seize that ship. But now he's traveling to the UK to push Iran to be even tougher on both Iran and Huawei. It is expected that he will have a more receptive audience in Boris Johnson than he did Theresa May. I've read a lot of analysis, and I don't understand Brexit and UK politics well enough to really weigh in and say, but there's a lot of awfully smart people saying that one of the things here is that Boris Johnson has kind of set this hard Brexit date, I believe for the end of October. And, deal or no deal, the UK is going to leave the European financial zone with all of its different agreements for trade, tax, and tariff rates. And so it could put the UK in a situation where I guess they're paying a lot more to export their goods. And so one way to make up for this would be to sign some sort of, sweetheart deal with the United States. And that way, I guess at least politically speaking, it looks like the UK government is making sure that the UK companies, maintain their, tax advantages that they're losing by leaving the Eurozone there. And for that reason, they may be more compliant with the UK foreign policy and especially against Iran increased in hawkishness to improve their relationship with the US. As I said, I don't know if I quite buy into that yet, but it's something to keep an eye on, and it certainly is a possibility to at least explain some of what's going on with the UK seizing the Iranian ship. And right now, talks being stalled out, and I think mainly because the UK is insisting that they cannot just trade ships, which I think would be the solution here. The Iranians have a UK detained ship, the UK has an Iranian ship, everybody just releases everybody and they go about their business, and that really takes down tensions. For some reason, the UK government won't sign on to that. New Secretary of Defense Mark Esper traveled to Mongolia this past week to, I guess, just establish deeper ties with that country. A couple months ago, or I guess a month ago, Trump was meeting with Kim Jong-un in the DMZ, and this was a great, very positive thing. And John Bolton, notably, was off in Mongolia. And everybody at the time was like, oh, great, he got marooned to Mongolia, which is, kind of one of those places like Timbuktu. Where the hell is it on the map? But it's definitely out in the middle of nowhere. That means nothing. But there is some importance to Mongolia, including its strategic position between Russia and China geographically, and the fact that you have high-ranking, defense officials and, John Bolton visiting that country in the past couple of months is a little bit worrisome. I think, if they're going to push Mongolia or help Mongolia to take a more hawkish position against one of its neighbors. All right, the North Korea stuff, since the DMZ meeting, hasn't been going as well as it should have. And that was because of the war games that were planned by the United States and South Korea. Now, the war games themselves never get much coverage. And if they do, it's usually just some CNN or some Fox reporter on the deck and, in the halls of an aircraft carrier going, wow, look how cool it all is. The planes go so fast and it's so dangerous, but our young men and women are just so, sit up straight and follow all orders exactly as they should to make sure everything goes so smoothly. and is, this great, fantastic situation. Well, these particular war games, as it turns out, and this is all in the Amuna, Alabama article that I'll link to in the show notes page, we're simulating the occupation of North Korea 90 days after a successful South Korean and U.S. invasion. And so it turns out that these are pretty serious for the North Korean government. And while U.S. defense officials and the U.S. media mindlessly, kind of just say, oh, these are scaled down, there's not a whole lot of personnel involved, they call them defensive. They say, oh, it's necessary to, maintain our defensive capabilities and maintain the defense of our allies in South Korea. But in reality, it's just practicing for if they overthrow Kim Jong-un, what do they all do to try to establish a friendly government in Pyongyang? Of course, I find this all for nothing because if North Korea does get invaded, it seems likely that Kim Jong-un would not sit on his nuclear weapons, but would attempt to use them, in which case, who knows what portion, if any, of North Korea is even going to be habitable by the end of this whole thing. And so after the DMZ talks, you had all these potential for, working groups to be established that way, all that behind the scenes work that needs to be done between U.S. and North Korean officials to work out and hammer out all these details, what portions of the North Korean nuclear energy program are going to be allowed to stay online, and in exchange for what sanctions being relieved, and what nuclear weapons being disclosed, and all this other very important information that likely will be worked out behind the scenes, I would guess, especially with like Donald Trump being one of the negotiating partners. He's probably doesn't seem to me have the stamina to sit through a long, hours-long meeting trying to decide and listening to these nuclear experts talk about, oh, well, having this facility open gives this capability and will allow this kind of enrichment within this many days and give you enough fuel to make this kind. He's not going to sit through that. And so all this work does have to be done behind the scenes. And if there's these big U.S. war games coming up with South Korea that simulate the occupation of North Korea, Kim Jong-un isn't likely, to feel like, first of all, the other side wants talks if they're practicing for the occupation of their country. And also, he has probably right-wing thoughts in his country, and he has to, maintain, to some extent, his political power, by not just sitting by and letting the Americans and the South Koreans do whatever the hell they want. And so, during this time, North Korea, has, I believe, done 4 different missile tests. Apparently, they've all been short-range missiles. I'm not sure exactly what types and variants and what's important. I did see that one important development on the North Korean missiles was they tested some kind of new guidance system to make their missiles more accurate. Now, the U.S. media is kind of using this against Trump, and to some extent the Democratic candidates are too, kind of saying, oh, look, he's too nice to Kim Jong-un, and it's allowing him to develop too many weapons. This is so dangerous, and all that kind of stuff. When in reality, it's the U.S. war games that are provoking all this, but of course nobody covers the war games, and if they do, they call them minor and defensive. Now, to Trump's credit, I suppose, he has downplayed all these missile tests and gotten several officials to do the same, like Mark Esper and John Bolton. But at the same time, North Korea is, I guess, upset by these war games, and it isn't just something that the U.S. could downplay forever. The North Koreans have given till the end of the year for some kind of deal to be made before they go back to testing and developing more intercontinental and nuclear weapons. Trump did get a letter from Kim Jong-un. I believe he called that letter beautiful again, and of course that drives everybody in the media insane. But what he did say is that, these war games, he doesn't like them either. And now he doesn't agree with Kim Jong-un for the reason, but he says they cost the U.S. a lot of money and he doesn't see a point to them. And that after the war games are over, North Korea will stop testing the missiles and then talks will begin. So let's hope that happens. He, I think, said something about maybe seeing Kim Jong-un very soon. So it seems like there is some potential future hope here. In Kashmir, the suppression of the people continues. I believe there's still no internet or phone access. And this is a very important Islamic holiday, right, going on right now. I think it's the Eid holiday. This actually last year, I think, had a ceasefire agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government for the first time in that war. You had the Turkish president calling the Saudi king. And so just as an example, this is kind of like an important holiday for the Muslims, and the Muslims in Kashmir cannot celebrate because of the Indian oppression. Aaron Margolis wrote the article I've been waiting for, so I will link to that in the show notes page. This is why I wanted just to kind of understand what was going on, because I know Eric has traveled there and knows a lot about the region, and he kind of explains that one of the big steps here is that it's going to allow non-Kashmiris to buy land in Kashmir, and he thinks that you're going to have a situation similar to Israel, where, they start to build settlements of Hindus within Kashmir, and as a way to shift the population balance, which right now is majority Muslim. Also in Kashmir, a 4-year-old boy, and this may have been on the Pakistani side of the line, picked up a bomblet, didn't realize it, and what bomblets are is you have a cluster bomb, it explodes, a whole bunch of other little bombs come out. The problem with cluster bombs is many of these don't explode. Historically, you look at Laos and Cambodia, I think, as countries that have really suffered years down the line of either children or farmers hitting these bomblets and being killed, destroying farm equipment, little kids losing arms and legs and all this kind of terrible stuff. Well, this little 4-year-old brings it home, brings it to the dinner table, and it goes off, killing the 4-year-old boy and 8 of his siblings and his mother. This is one of the stories that maybe resonates a little bit more with people, so I'm going to link to it in the show notes page if you want to share it, just because it does take, one individual and kind of explain how the repercussions of war go on for years afterwards, and this is the kind of terror that people in these countries live with, that, your little 4-year-old may find a little piece of metal, and unlike, here where it's probably harmless or at worst, has a little bit of tetanus on it, you go to the doctor and get a tetanus shot, and here it ends up blowing this little kid up. It's extremely tragic. Afghanistan, the question mark is if we'll get a peace deal soon. I'm reading conflicting reports on the actual status of the talks between some kind of agreement. All the differences have been worked out and they're just waiting on approvals to the ended talks on a positive note, but there are still differences to be worked out. I've read reports that something could actually be signed this week. I mean, kind of a wait and see mode on this one. The Syrian army took a strategic town in the Idlib province, continuing to make gains in that offensive against the Al-Qaeda-backed rebels there. I will note that there hasn't been the typical U.S. media hysteria that you have seen when Assad has taken ground against Al-Qaeda in the past in Syria. Usually there's cries that his air campaign is too brutal and that he's killing too many civilians. Of course, it is more or less true that Assad is waging a way too brutal campaign in the past using barrel bombs in, somewhat of crazy circumstances. This is the way that, he has been able to not have his entire country overrun by these, Wahhabi, Salafist, jihadist types. There's been several clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Israel between the Israeli Defense Forces and the Palestinian people. Again, important Muslim holiday right now, so a lot of people going to worship, and these clashes, I'm sure, just destroy any kind of possibility of chance that the, Israeli and Palestinian people could start to move closer together. Having these kind of insults thrown at the Muslim people during their important holidays. A U.S. soldier was killed in Iraq. From what I understand, he was on an advise and accompany mission, which is a really interesting way to throw a new phrase out there, because in the past it was always advise and assist, which suggested that the U.S. soldiers were way back from the front lines and not in danger. And now they, changed assist to accompany, which sounds pretty much like a synonym and kind of the same thing. But if they're actually going into these dangerous raids with the Iraqi forces, it puts the U.S. troops in a lot more danger. Again, something that maybe should be talked about in the United States and Congress and the Democrat debates that gets absolutely no mention. All right, so talking about Saudi's big loss here in Yemen, you go back to previous episodes of the show, but it's been a while since I talked about it because the Saudi coalition hasn't had too much infighting, I would say, in the past year. But the Saudi coalition in Yemen is kind of a ragtag group. There's a lot of Sudanese mercenaries. There's a lot of just mercenaries either from the Horn of Africa, people migrating into Yemen looking for jobs. You have Yemeni people that don't have a whole lot of, I think, care in who wins the war, but rather, just need the paycheck of being a soldier. You have, I guess, more or less loyalists to the Yemeni government who actually fight as, kind of a part of the Yemeni army because they want to be there. and then you had UAE-backed forces, and that included Al-Qaeda and ISIS types. Now, the UAE has backed out, and I saw then a couple attacks on the Saudi forces by the AQAP and ISIS, so it seemed to me that maybe the Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters are breaking away from that Saudi coalition and kind of going their own direction again, because for a while they actually held on the map a good amount of territory, and was only through working with the UAE that they gave that up and turned it over, and then in some cases joined the Saudi coalition. I should mention there's probably a lot of tribal fighters on both sides of this war as well. Yemen's I guess, fairly fractured and different society that is only ever loosely held together anyways. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that, these coalitions struggle to stay together. Another important group within that Saudi coalition was a group called the Southern Separatists. They opposed the Houthis, were enemies of the Houthis, and were also enemies of the Saudi-backed government, mainly because it supported the Muslim Brotherhood affiliate in Yemen, al-Islah. And in fact, at one point, the UAE paid a bunch of American mercenaries to go and assassinate the political, not military, the political leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen. Anyways, I guess with the whole thing falling apart between the Southern Separatists and the Saudis and the UAE leaving that coalition, and I have read, because I haven't talked about the UAE leaving the coalition a lot, I was worried that maybe it was an in-name only thing, but at least half of their forces that were deployed to Yemen have now left, including most of the forces that were going into the Battle of Hadada. So yeah, with the UAE leaving that coalition, it seems like it's fracturing more. The Southern Separatists have now taken the presidential palace in Aden, which is actually the second capital of Aden, as the Saudi-backed forces already got ran out of the, official capital of Yemen, Sana'a, and fled to Aden. Well, now this has been taken from them by the Southern Separatists. They're called the Southern Separatists, of course, because Yemen was once two countries, not just one, and the southern part was actually within the Soviet orbit. This was a country that was united in 1990 and has only ever been united under one man who is now dead, Ali Abdullah Saleh. This has to be seen as a huge blow to the Saudi war effort here. I guess there's one possibility that maybe some kind of negotiation could be worked out again. Even though the UAE is leaving this coalition, I haven't read anything to suggest that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is falling out with Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the UAE. So maybe, MBS could put some pressure on MBZ and get him to, have the Southern Separatists back down, because I think this has had to happen in the past before too. But this time seems much more significant with the UAE already backing out of this whole conflict. Saudi Arabia is now bombing Aden, which is, again, now held by the Southern Separatists. I have a huge question mark here, because somebody has to explain if the U.S. is assisting in the bombing of Aden, and you have to imagine that Saudi Arabia is essentially using the same networks that they're using to bomb the Houthis in northern Yemen. What kind of authority the U.S. is using to assist them in bombing their former, kind of allied group there. It's a real head scratcher how Trump has the authority to wage 90% of the wars that he's waging and 90% of his foreign policy. But, now with the attacking of the Southern Separatists, that seems like another huge question mark. And of course, will probably make Yemen a whole lot less safe and increase the humanitarian crisis there. As at least before this, Aden I know a port. It wasn't a deep water port, but they could, bring some goods and stuff through Aden. But if that, port ends up either being sanctioned by the Saudis or blockaded, much like the port in Hadada is, it could become a real crisis, even more so than it already is in Yemen. All right, guys, that's what I have for the show this week. Of course, it seems like Operation Decisive Storm, what Saudi Arabia went into Yemen with 3.5 years ago now, is going to continue to drag on. As much as it looks like this should be the ultimate defeat for the MBS policy in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, that the U.S. has been drug along with, that this would just be it. But it's, I think, going to continue to drag on because I can't see Trump or MBS backing down without some kind of victory. Share the show. libertarianinstitute.org, checkpointasia.net. That site's run by my good friend and former guest on the show, Marko Marjanovic. Check out The Patreon page, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, $5 a month gets you in on the live stream. Twitter at KYAAALE, private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus.